This morning it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Darrell Issa, representative of the 49th District of California. First elected to Congress in 2000 for the 49th District, Congressman Issa currently serves as the ranking member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He is also a member of the House Judiciary Committee. Representative Issa founded Directed Electronics, a California-based industry-leading manufacturer of automobile security and convenience products. He has served as the chairman of the Consumer Electronics Association, as a member of the Board of Governors of Electronic Industry Association, and as director of the San Diego Economic Development Association and the Greater San Diego County Chamber of Commerce. He has served in the United States Army. He has attended as an ROTC scholarship. He is a graduate of Siena Heights University in Adrian, Michigan, and serves as a member of the University Board of Trustees. He and his wife Kathy are longtime residents of Vista, California, and they have one son, William. It is with my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the 71st Convention, the Honorable Darrell Issa.
You know, when you have those introductions, you say, oh, if my staff could just put the other one in. The one to talk about my federal service. Well, thank you for having me here, and I have no illusions. I'm here because I'm the new ranking member of government reform. But Tom Davis said there'd be good days like this, and so this will be one of those good days. The subject, obviously, today is in a time of, if you will, post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, post-9/11, and I guess post-economic meltdown, where are we going with the federal workforce? We've had approaching a decade of one-time events in which each time we said, well, you know, we're going to have to fill in with this, we're going to have to surge with that, we don't have enough in the federal workforce, we're going to have to outsource this, we're going to have to outsource that. We're going to deal with problems with a Band-Aid. Well, today, I'll tell you that Chairman Towns and myself have dedicated the next year to trying to come up with real bipartisan solutions to, if you will, reinvigorate the federal workforce. As we all know, the United States government's the largest employer of people in our country. It's not unusual. We're also the largest employer after the military. That's also not unusual in most countries. However, for more than 20 years, we've kept saying, including the post office, who's not represented directly here, but who I've had the opportunity to speak to since I've been the ranking member, to say, well, can we reinvent federal service? Can we make it more like the private sector? And in so doing, we've had a number of grand experiments, including a considerable amount of outsourcing. So much so that when I took on this role this year, along with Chairman Towns, we discovered that the #1 complaint we would hear from federal workers is, when are we going to actually supervise procurement directly ourselves rather than supervise people who are outsourced, who are in fact doing our procurement for us? That's a sad commentary on where we are in the workforce today. Now, as we can imagine, I see a few people that are nearly as old as I am out here. Well, nearly. And for many of you, you're saying, well, okay, that's great. Your grand scheme will certainly last more than the time I have left to work. Well, part of the grand scheme has to be, how do we more intelligently take people who choose to retire or for whom the existing system has almost mandated a retirement? When I was in the Army from 1970 to 1980, you know, we all talked about, well, are you going to work for half pay after 20? In my case, I decided to work for no pay after 10 and go into the private sector. But I think of that every day when I look at the federal system that decade after decade has not reformed a basic system that that because we're a defined benefit plan, we literally encourage people to retire and go work for somebody else. For all of us here today and for all our federal workers, we have to do two things. First of all, we have to come up with schemes which are in your best interest to stay in the federal workforce, either directly or in a post-retirement role for as long as possible. Your skills are essential. Secondly, we have to come up with a new retirement system. Defined benefit plans have shown their weaknesses time and time again. One of them is that you lack portability if you need to change, and you lack an incentive to say, I have my retirement, but every day that I stay, I'm better off for staying. So modernizing both for our armed forces, which is not within my committee's jurisdiction, and for all other federal workers, which is crucial. In the meantime, there are a number of small moves. For those who are taking notes, H.R. 1203, the premium conversion. This is something that my predecessor, Tom Davis, both as chairman and ranking member, supported, and I'll be supporting that legislation again. By the way, not because you're federal workers, but because I support it for every worker. It is sort of insane to say that on a Tuesday you get to deduct your health care if you're an employer, you get to deduct it if you're in a cafeteria plan, but on Wednesday you can't. We have to have a uniform system for current workers, whether they're covered by their employer's retirement or not, and for retirees, whether they're federal workers or not. And that's something that I happen to be an Arab American, so I use the term camel's nose under the tent flap every chance I get. But you know, I look for every opportunity to nibble away at places that logically should have pre-tax expenditures that currently have post-tax expenditures. One of the other points that were wisely put into my talking points today was to talk about the GS-15s. I will tell you that there's not an easy solution to it, but if I have my way, we'll eliminate the pay cap for GS-15s. Now, that doesn't mean that we'll necessarily keep the hypothetical pay that some 7,000 GS-15s do not get, do not receive. It means that it's insane to have a theoretical pay that you don't pay people, but then you count it toward retirement. We have to unify that to where people's legitimate pay, for whatever reason we want to keep them, is there. And in a nutshell, why would we tell people, we'll pay you more when you retire? You've vested enough to retire, so we're going to pay you less while you work. How many people here can figure out how to use but not game that system? Exactly, and so that's the only reason we don't have more than 7,000 GS-15s that are caught in that today, is that people pretty quickly look and say, my federal government is telling me to retire to get my higher retirement pay. And then if you're like many people who retire, you may get a footnote in the newspaper as how outrageous that that guy's retirement was such a large portion of his or her current pay. We've tried to fix sick leave credit for a number of years. I'm hoping that Chairman Townsend and I can work on a compromise this year that would define a portion, a reasonable portion of sick leave that could be taken into retirement. It would also define a reasonable portion of sick leave that could be used in the last 2 years, so that what we would be doing is sending a consistent message to yourselves, of course, but also to the entire federal workforce, that if you're sick, we want you to use your sick leave appropriately. If, in fact, you have an amount left at the end of your career, the last thing in the world we want you to do is to do terminal sick leave. We want to enjoy your work right up, yeah, there's a few smiles out there. Is the term actually terminal sick leave? I never knew one, I just figured I'd throw that in from my old Army days. But we have to get past that. We have to get to where we can legitimately know that, that people will use their sick leave appropriately, save it if they have enjoyed good health, be reasonably compensated for the excess, but not turn it into either a year's extra pay or a year of not showing up at the end, both of which are undesirable. Chairman Towns and I have talked about some midway points. We'll be reaching out to federal managers particularly to say, where is the sweet spot in making sure that your employees do the right thing before they retire and the right thing in the last year of their retirement. For the last 4 years, we've worked on trying to refine federal workforce telecommuting. And as all of you whose job it is to not only control a workforce that seems to be increasingly spread out, but also to develop a culture. I will tell you, I've been a supporter of telework of all sorts. I've seen the strengths of it when we get a talented engineer or scientist to work for the patent office, where they otherwise would never work right here in Crystal City, but they would work in Denver, Colorado, evaluating patents. Mostly, it's a by computer job today. So I've seen when it works very well. I've also seen when it turns into a challenge of rotating desks, infrastructure that is deferred so that you can never actually get all of your workforce in one place at one time, a control problem, and particularly managers who have told me in no uncertain terms, how do you develop a culture when you never see all the people in any one day that are supposed to work together? So I'm looking forward to the federal government, at least from Congress, making the funds available, but looking to all of you for the guidance of what jobs it makes sense for, what work groups it makes sense for, and which ones it doesn't. And I'm going to be one of those people that is not looking for a quick fix of we won't build a building, how do we remote all these people? Because I think that drives a decision wrong. We should build or rent the infrastructure necessary for the federal workforce if that's where they need to be. And if in fact, just the opposite, they need to be either working in remote areas, working out of their automobiles, you need to tell us that. Last one that may be more controversial is S507, which is Daniel Akaka's bill to basically say, Hawaii gets extra pay both during their work life and afterwards. I want to be very, very cautious on having workers paid different work at different times, or different pay at different times in different places without very good temporary reasons. And last but not least, and I'm very aware that the retired federal workforce is powerful, we choose in retirement to live where we want. I don't believe that if you choose to retire in Hawaii, you should be paid more for it. I think we have to make a decision that federal retirement as a defined benefit plan is assumed to be a fixed benefit anywhere in the world. And if you choose to retire in Cabo, I will tell you it's less expensive, but you will need an armed guard. And if you choose to retire in Hawaii, you will spend more time on the beach because it's free. So I'm hoping to take questions on a number of subjects that, thank goodness, my staff said not briefed at the end of this. I'm also hoping that many of you will take it on yourself to correspond with my office and, quite frankly, with the majority and minority in the weeks and months to come on areas that you think we should be looking into. My predecessor, Tom Davis, really cared about the federal workforce and stood out among Republicans as somebody who saw the federal workforce as an asset and not simply a place from which to outsource. Chairman Ed Towns, different than Henry Waxman, also is looking at the federal workforce as someone to work with and a group that we need to reinvigorate through congressional leadership. At the same time, we're no different than any other government oversight committee has ever been. We are the committee of the whistleblower, and we will of course, by definition, be looking for opportunities to help you make the system work better. And if that means that someone comes to us and says, this rule is so stupid that nobody obeys it, or on the other hand, this is a good rule but no one obeys it, that becomes an obligation of our committee. So both on the positive side of things we can do to help you do your job in a positive way, and quite frankly, never forgetting that we are the committee of whistleblowers, the other side. And with that, I've been told that if I don't overstay my welcome, I can get some questions. Okay, my other brother Darrell says yes.
Going back here, please.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Sherman Williams. The question I have is the new administration has signed out an executive order to relook at what is inherently governmental and what can be contracted out. Is your committee going to look at that also?
But it's a great question. Yes, we are. And I dealt with it in one fundamental way, which is Ed Towns and I have had a number of meetings to try to come up and figure out what we agree on. And what we agree on is that the control over subcontractors or contractors, or if you will, the outsourcing of anything that the government wants, whether it's a purchase or a service, and more than half actually of what we buy in the civilian force are services, not items. The control of that is inherently governmental. And one thing that we can see is that we've gotten to where we kept cranking down for a number of years and claiming efficiency that, oh, we're using less people to do procurement. Well, what we were doing is following the lead. If you tell me to get my numbers down, I get my numbers down by sending out, I don't know, use Lockheed Martin, whoever, a contract that essentially is a contract to go in contracts. So I think if I take the president at one of the critical areas, we need to develop the in-house expertise to know what the specifications for all procurement contracts are, both products and services. We need to rely on federal workers who have no financial gain, by definition, in the process to make the decisions on who the best fit is, because the best fit has become often more complicated than just the lowest price. So I think that's one area to start. We're certainly looking for other areas where you see that something has been outsourced, and in fact it could be competitively bid back in to the federal workforce. And when I say competitively bid, if we simply don't have the expertise, and a good example is maintaining your PCs in the workforce. If we can do it with federal workers and be competitive, we should. If we look at who makes sure that Microsoft's Windows blue screen of death is not plaguing your PC, that's not inherently government. What you're working with on that PC is the maintenance of the PC may not be. But I'll take other suggestions if you have.
Well, I think there's also an action to stop A76 studies, which I guess can be looked at both ways. It's either competing work outside or keeping work inside. So I'm not sure if that helps your argument to bring stuff back in, or if that is something that will just stop and won't go either way.
Well, I think that where the president, Ed Towns, and I agree is where we'll probably start, which is that knowing how to write a spec for what we want to procure, we need to have a certain level of that in-house, or in fact we're by definition open to being used or abused by one or more contractors. A little bit about my background. I spent 10 years in the military, left at a time, sort of the end of the Jimmy Carter era. I didn't feel terribly motivated to stay in. I didn't feel that the military was needed at that moment or appreciated. We didn't outsource the military, but we did outsource many of the things that I was used to that military did as a young officer. The idea that you have to do your own cooking today is no longer part of the military thought. The huge amounts of people who used to be military mess hall runners is no longer a career. I accept that, and I consider that ultimately the teeth of the military are the intelligence personnel, the literal combat troops, and the people who can make sure that firepower is delivered. And the question of how you get lunch, as long as strategically you can get your troops lunch, is reasonably something that can be outsourced. Having said that, I've been to Iraq. We control Iraqi reconstruction on our committee as one of the oversights. And it's amazing that in the name of keeping the number of troops down, we paid more money for somebody to provide us that meal by a factor of 2, roughly, than it would have cost for us to provide our own meal. So that's a good example of where you look and say, who was calculating the cost when they decided that every aspect of Iraq was going to be outsourced? And I won't talk about the cost of the embassy in Iraq because it turns out the cost of the visitor center of the capital is slightly higher. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You mentioned that you were interested in the federal pension system and modernizing it. Could you please share with us what your initial thoughts are?
Absolutely. We have a system, you know, if you will, the 1.7% for so many years and then a declining. It's a classic defined benefit, and it's also if you will, a reducing benefit program. The more years you spend, the less you will receive inherently. And if you look at it compared to our TSP, which is a defined contribution with a match, and you ask yourself, well, wait a second here. If we logically, over time, merge the two so that the longer you stay, the greater your benefit is, why wouldn't that make more sense? Your TSP goes up in value every year you stay, not necessarily with the stock market. But the base amount that you've contributed and that the government has matched continues to increase every year. So the longer you stay, the more money's there. In fact, and by the way, you own it. It's portable and it's inheritable. The nature of the defined benefit plan we have is that the longer you stay beyond your first date of retirement, and particularly if that date is also the date of collection, you're working to your detriment, because in the long run, if you're purely looking at money, you actually are working for less and less money. And there's been a number of suggestions. We're going to look at it for perhaps 2 Congresses, maybe more, in order to get it right. But in a sense, if you flip it on its head and say, well, wait a second, if you work for the federal government for 5 years and you vest, how much do you really expect to get versus if you work for 25 years and we have an incentive program to keep you beyond there? One of them may be not dealing with the core retirement, but rather, if you will, a early retirement reentry system. And I'll give you the example. If at age 50, with 25 years of service, just as an example, you were allowed to go to senior status, and I use that term because federal judges use that term. You go to senior status. At that point, your federal retirement locks in, and you can collect it just as though you're retired. Your pay now includes a premium for the fact that you're in a retired status, but no additional amount is put in. That can either be deferred by putting it into your TSP as an additional contribution, or in fact you can cash it out. Why do that? Because we want to have if you remain on senior status beyond your earliest retirement, we want to have an incentive that says we'll pay you every bit as much or more as you see it, while in fact not changing how much we pay you. Bottom line, it says there's an advantage in staying in the federal workforce versus double dipping by retiring and going to some other contractor and trying to fill out another career. It's that mid-career person that we're looking for ways to say, is there a senior status capability that probably won't work for many of you, but would work for the next generation coming up, where we can keep them through a period, we can make a decision then to thank them very much for their service, or in fact ask them to stay on beyond when they would ordinarily retire. Those are some of the ideas. I will tell you, Ed Towns and I do not claim to have a monopoly on it. I'm 55, he's 75. The only thing I can tell you is we both think a lot about retirement compared to where we did 20 years ago.
So then, in your scheme of things, the civil service retirement system would stay the way it is, and you would be modifying the way the FERS operates, is what you're basically saying?
Primarily. If you look at the private sector, defined benefits plans are going away. They're going away for 2 reasons. First of all, you don't know what they're going to cost you, which means, and remember that we all serve the government, but we serve it from a different perspective. I have a constitutional mandate that all monies must be allocated within a 2-year period. Constitutionally, believe it or not, I have no authority to offer to spend money more than 2 years at a time. Meaning that if a future Congress were to be less generous, all of your promises go away under law. In other words, FERS doesn't have to be funded one day past the end of a Congress. And that seems a little absurd, but it's really true. So every time we say, well, we're only spending this amount, and then we have this unknown amount that we're obligating for 10, 15, 20 years, you say, well, what's the cost? Well, we don't know. We don't know if we have a breakthrough and 75 stops being the average age of life expectancy and 95 becomes the average age, what would be the cost? So one of the challenges is moving somewhat from defined benefits, which includes obviously our Social Security in addition to all others, to a defined contribution. I don't think that's a shift you do quickly. I think that's a shift you start with people in their 20s and 30s. But at the same time, people our ages, we're losing a huge amount of those workers because the workforce system encourages, even if you're in good health, for you to go get a job somewhere else, perhaps make as much or even more, but more importantly, begin enjoying your retirement benefits today. That's been wrong for decades, and we need to have a system that allows us to encourage people to remain in the federal workforce if that's in the federal workforce's benefit.
Sir, do you support mandatory contributions to the TSP by new employees?
Well, I'm a libertarian, so I guess I would say, it's like I don't support mandatory helmets, but I always wear a helmet when I ride my motorcycle. I do believe that people need to be encouraged in every way, shape, or form. As long as we have a generous match, we're doing enough that a mandatory, quote-unquote mandatory participation in TSP isn't necessary. But if there were no other retirement system and we're trying to figure out how to get people to contribute to their retirement, yeah, I would, because that's personal responsibility. Today, I'd say no, I don't, because I think our match is generous enough that encourages people to do the right thing on their own.
I'll just share one comment with you, and then I'll give the mic to the next person. My only concern about mandatory TSP is for the military, and I have a vested interest because my son-in-law is a Marine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, he's been to Iraq 3 times and now he's in Afghanistan, so I don't know. But anyways, they said 75% of the military do not participate in the TSP. And I'm here to tell you, the reason they don't is because they're paid poverty salary. When a wife comes on base and goes for orientation, the first thing they tell her is how to file for WIC and food stamps. So if you have to go for food stamps and WIC, yeah, you're not going to contribute to the TSP because you need every nickel coming into the house. So if you're going to make those boys pay up or girls pay up, you need to up their salary too.
And if I can do one thing, Darrell, this is not a military conversation, but having spent 10 years in active and then another 10 in the reserves, I believe in the all-volunteer Army. I think Charlie Rangel, who sits across from me, is disingenuous when he says he wants to bring the draft back. And the reason is just what you said. If we don't pay enough to get people in, and granted we pay less than perhaps we should, it shows in enlistments. And as long as we have an all-volunteer Army, Congress has a harder time abusing our soldiers and sailors and Marines than it does in an all-voluntary. I support getting better and better pay, particularly for those who decide to remain beyond their first enlistment. And I say that because those who enlisted already have 3 and 4 kids are usually the ones that show up at Camp Pendleton applying for WIC and so on, meaning they've already made life decisions that probably make it pretty hard for them to develop the career pattern that is historically the military service. But I do hear what you're saying, and it is a challenge for us to make sure that, particularly past the first enlistment, that we have a pay system that maintains those soldiers, sailors, and Marines to keep them on for those careers. And your example is a good one where somebody already has 3 tours, knows the hardest part of the business. That's somebody that we want to keep on for a career, and we want to make sure that we pay our NCOs and obviously our officers, but particularly our NCOs, enough to keep them and their families in federal service for the long run. So it does play into both how we pay our military, but also, quite candidly, most of you, how many of you are prior military? Okay. Did you ever ask yourself why we don't have a program to do even better, bringing our military who have chosen to move on into the federal workforce? That's the other half of it, is that if there's one thing that I hope to accomplish is to modernize the ability to take those who have honorable federal service in our military and further incentivize them to come into to federal service. The post office does a fairly good job, but overall the federal workforce in some ways loses those people because they leave the military hoping to make the big bucks, and sometimes we don't look like the big bucks they were hoping to make. So I'm going to get the hook now. I want to thank all of you. This was intended to be a get to know me a little bit. When you're in Washington, please use our staff as a resource for not just gripes and complaints, but suggestions on what we can do. You know, there's the old chain of command, and that's wonderful, but the bureaucracy is not necessarily good at giving us new ideas. And I know you'll leaflet me if you like or don't like my vote on a particular piece of legislation, but don't be afraid to email governor reform, both sides, majority and minority, with ideas on what we should be looking into to make this federal workforce work better, some of which will continue to use outsourcing if it makes us more effective, but also developing the professionalism in-house. Thank you.